Elias had always been different from the other villagers, quiet and thoughtful. He spent his days in the small, cluttered workshop at the edge of town, fixing engines and machines of every kind, from broken carts to rusted generators. But while his hands worked with tools, his mind wandered to distant places full of mystery and adventure. The villagers often laughed at him, calling him the tinkerer or the dreamer, but Elias knew there was more to life than the narrow streets and tired faces of his home. One rainy afternoon, as the storm raged outside, he was repairing an old brass engine that had belonged to a traveling merchant when something unusual slipped from a hidden compartment, a piece of torn parchment, yellowed and fragile, covered in strange symbols and faint lines. Elias carefully unfolded it and gasped as he realized it was a map unlike anything he had ever seen. There were markings for mountains that seemed to move in the distance, rivers that shimmered in impossible colors, and in the corner a small sketch of a cage, with jagged lines surrounding it. His heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. He had heard stories from the elders about ancient creatures hidden in ruins long forgotten about by time, and now the map seemed to be guiding him to one of those secrets. The idea that he could actually find something extraordinary made his hands tremble, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of real adventure. He pored over the symbols, trying to decipher them, tracing lines with his fingers, imagining the treasures and dangers that awaited him beyond the familiar forest that bordered his village. The more he studied the map, the more he felt a strange pull, a whisper in the back of his mind urging him to go further than he ever had. The rain pattered against the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks of the workshop like the world itself was calling to him. It was almost impossible to ignore, and Elias knew deep down that if he stayed he would never feel the thrill of discovery that now burned in his chest. He packed a small satchel with tools, lanterns, and food, the map folded carefully inside, and for the first time, he looked at the village not as a place he belonged, but as a place he was leaving behind. As he stepped outside, the storm had lessened, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. The path to the ruins would not be easy. Twisted roots and hidden rocks made every step a challenge, and yet Elias moved with determination. He kept thinking of the map, the cage, and the creature that might be waiting for him. He imagined massive wings and glowing eyes, and a presence so powerful it said could shake the earth itself. He could almost hear the low growl of something alive and ancient calling to him through the mist. Night fell, and Elias made camp under a large twisted tree, staring up at the dark clouds, wondering if he had made a mistake or if he was finally about to live the life he had always dreamed about. The map rested on his chest, and he traced the lines with his fingers, imagining the journey that lay ahead. He did not know what dangers awaited him, or if he would even return, but in that moment he felt truly alive as the wind whispered through the branches and the fire flickered. He promised himself that no matter what he would follow the map to the end. Elias traveled through the forest, guided by the torn map and the faint glow of lantern light casting shadows across the twisted roots and gnarled trunks. Each step brought new sounds, the rustle of unseen creatures, the snap of branches underfoot, and the distant howl of wolves in the night. His heart raced with both fear and excitement. The further he went, the more the forest seemed too close in, as if testing his resolve, whispering secrets he could not quite understand. The path led him over uneven terrain, through thickets of thorny bushes and across streams with icy water that chilled his bones. Yet he pressed on, imagining the ruins that awaited him hidden somewhere beyond the darkness. He remembered the stories told by elders of a castle abandoned for centuries where strange experiments and terrible magic had once taken place, a place no one dared enter for fear of curses and monsters that were said to still linger within its walls. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the canopy, he glimpsed the silhouette of the ruins looming on a distant hill, jagged stone towers and crumbling walls rising from the mist like the bones of some giant creature. His breath caught, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. The map had led him true. Yet standing before the castle now, he understood why it had been avoided for so long. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Elias approached cautiously, the ground littered with debris, broken statues, and shards of stained glass crunching beneath his boots as he stepped through the massive broken gates, vines creeping over every surface, and the walls covered in dark moss giving the impression that the ruins themselves were alive. He paused to take in the scene, the silence, broken only by the distant call of birds and the whisper of the wind through empty corridors inside the ruins. The darkness was almost complete. Only slivers of light filtered through shattered windows, revealing flickers of movement in the shadows. shapes that could have been tricks of his imagination, or perhaps creatures that had made the ruins their home. Elias tightened his grip on his tools, and the map, remembering the cage and the creature it promised. He could feel the pull of something ancient waiting deeper within, calling to him with a low hum that vibrated through the stone floor beneath his feet. Every step forward was measured, careful, yet bold, for Elias knew that one wrong move could trigger traps or awaken something hostile. The air smelled of dust and damp stone, and he imagined the countless secrets hidden in these walls, secrets that had been forgotten for centuries. He ran his fingers along the carvings on the walls, strange symbols and jagged lines that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, as if they were alive with magic that had not fully faded. Hours passed as he explored winding corridors and collapsed chambers, until finally he descended a spiral staircase that seemed to lead to the heart of the ruins. The map trembled in his hands, and his pulse quickened, for he knew he was close to the cage, close to the creature that had been waiting centuries for someone to set it free. Every instinct screamed at him to be ready for anything, and yet the excitement that burned in his chest pushed him onward, a thrill unlike anything he had ever known, driving him into the unknown. Elias descended the spiral staircase with his lantern held high, shadows stretching across the cracked stone walls, each step echoing through the silent ruins, sending shivers down his spine. The air grew colder and heavier as he reached the bottom. A vast chamber opened before him, dark and cavernous, filled with the scent of damp stone and rusted metal. His breath caught when he saw it in the center. A massive cage, blackened and twisted, with jagged spikes rising toward the ceiling, and intricate runes carved into every barth. Cage was unlike anything Elias had imagined. Its construction was precise yet otherworldly. The metal seemed alive, humming faintly with energy, as though it remembered the creature trapped within every lock and chain. Radiated power and age, and the very air around it seemed to vibrate with anticipation. He approached cautiously, every step measured the floor, scattered with broken gears and ancient tools, perhaps left behind by those who had tried and failed to control what was inside. Elias ran his fingers over the cold metal, tracing the carvings, trying to decipher the runes, but they resisted understanding, flickering in his mind. Like fragments of a dream, he could feel the pull of something alive within, something vast and ancient calling out to him, in a language older than words. His pulse raced, his hands shook with a mixture of fear and excitement. He knew he was standing before the heart of the ruins, before the very thing that had been kept secret for centuries. He examined the locks, complex mechanisms interwoven with magical glyphs that seemed to respond to his touch. Every gear and lever tested his ingenuity and knowledge of machines. He set to work improvising tools and making careful adjustments, measuring twice and testing every move, knowing that one mistake could cost him his life. The minutes stretched into hours. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the shadows dancing in the flickering lantern light, making him feel watched and yet driven onward by curiosity and the promise of discovery. Finally, as Elias turned the last lever, a deep vibration ran through the chamber. The cage shuddered, and the runes glowed brighter and brighter until they pulsed like a heartbeat. The metal twisted as if resisting the freedom it was being forced to give, and a low growl echoed from within, a sound that shook the floor and rattled the walls. The vibration traveled through Elias, making him stumble backward, his heart pounding. In his chest he stared in awe at the faint outline of a massive form coiled within the cage. The creature shifted slightly, a shadow among shadows, but the sheer size and power emanating from it left Elias breathless. He had expected something dangerous, but nothing had prepared him for the raw presence of the dragon, its scales glimmering faintly, even in the dim light, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark, and a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth reverberated through the chamber. It was alive, ancient and deadly, and yet Elias felt a strange pull of recognition and connection. He realized that this creature had been imprisoned not just by metal, but by centuries of fear and misunderstanding, and now it was awakening because of him. A mixture of fear, excitement, and responsibility surged through him, for he knew that the decision to free it would change his life forever, and nothing would ever be the same. The dragon moved again, stretching its massive limbs and wings, the shadows flickering across the walls like fire, and Elias stood frozen on the threshold of history, staring into eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. Elias stumbled backward, his lantern swinging wildly, throwing long flickering shadows across the cavernous chamber. The dragon inside the cage shifted slightly, its massive wings twitching in the darkness. sending a gust of wind that rattled the loose stones and stirred dust into the air. The low growl he had heard earlier deepened into a resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through his chest and make the very floor tremble beneath his feet. Every instinct screamed at him to run, yet he could not tear his eyes away from the glowing eyes that watched him intently. A strange intelligence radiated from them, assessing him, measuring his courage and his intentions, and despite the fear curling in his stomach, he felt a pull, a connection that was impossible to deny. He had freed this creature, yet the reality of its power hit him like a physical force, and the thrill of discovery mixed with terror in a way he had never felt before. Dragon shifted again, stretching its massive limbs and flexing its wings. The movement caused the metal of the cage to creak and groan, as though it were protesting the freedom it had been forced to allow. Sparks of energy flickered along the runes, carved into the bars, casting an eerie glow across the chamber. The air crackled with static, and the hairs on Ilias's arms stood on end. He realized he had unlocked something far beyond any machine he had ever repaired, something alive, ancient, and unstoppably his. Mind raced as he considered the possibilities. The villagers had told stories of dragons as monsters or guardians, but this creature defied every tale he had heard. It was terrifying and majestic, and the weight of centuries of captivity pressed down on him. In that moment he felt the responsibility of what he had done. The cage had held not just flesh and scale, but history and fury, and now all of it was awake. And Ilias took a cautious step closer, his hands trembling. He held out a wrench as if offering a gesture of peace, though he knew it was meaningless in the presence of such raw power. The dragon blinked slowly, and the growl softened into a low purr that reverberated through the chamber like distant thunder. It tilted its head and regarded him, curiously, testing his courage and perhaps sensing that he had not come to harm it intentionally. The sensation was overwhelming and left Ilias breathless. Suddenly, the cage shuddered violently. Sparks arced between the bars, and a surge of energy pulsed outward. A blinding flash filled the room. For a heartbeat, and Ilias shielded his eyes. When he looked again, the dragon was moving more freely, coiling and stretching, as if testing the limits of its confinement. The chamber shook and dust rained from the ceiling, and Ilias realized the creature was stronger than he could have imagined. Its power contained only by fragile metal, and centuries of magic. Fear and exhilaration warred within him. He knew he had set in motion something that could not be controlled, and yet he could not turn back. The dragon's eyes met his again, and in them, he glimpsed not just danger but awareness and perhaps even gratitude. A spark of understanding passed between human and beast, and in that instant Ilias understood that nothing would ever be the same. The first spark of freedom had been lit, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The chamber trembled as the dragon stretched its massive wings, catching the flickering lantern light and sending shadows dancing across the walls. The sound was deafening, a low roar that reverberated like rolling thunder through the stone corridors. Ilias stumbled backward, heart hammering in his chest, yet he could not tear his eyes away from the awe-inspiring sight before him. The creature coiled and uncoiled with a grace that belied its immense size. Its scales shimmered darkly with flecks of molten color glowing faintly from deep within, as if the centuries of imprisonment had forged power into its very flesh. Each movement of the dragon sent sparks from the runes along the cage flying across the chamber, and Ilias ducked instinctively as small arcs of energy crackled around him. He could feel the heat of the dragon radiating outward. Each exhale, a gust of wind that whipped his hair and ruffled his clothes, and yet, despite the danger, he could sense something cautious in the creature's gaze, as though it was testing him, measuring whether he was friend or threat. Its amber eyes glowed with ancient intelligence, eyes that had seen empires rise and fall and yet now focused solely on him. The dragon shifted closer to the bars, sniffing the air, the deep rumble vibrating from its throat like a distant earthquake. Ilias's hands shook as he extended one trembling hand toward the massive head that now loomed inches from him. He expected fury. Instead, the dragon's eyes softened, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps curiosity, passing over its face. Its massive jaws opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, yet it did not strike. A single spark of connection passed between them, a silent understanding born of centuries of isolation, and the courage of one human who had dared to free it. Then, with a sudden surge of power, the dragon thrust its clawed foot against the cage, shaking it violently. The metal groaned and sparks flew as the runes flared, and Ilias had to leap to the side to avoid being crushed. The creature's wings unfurled, fully filling the chamber with a gust of wind strong enough to send dust and debris Swirling in every direction, the dragon let out a roar that shook the walls and rattled the stones, echoing like the voice of the earth itself. It was terrifying and magnificent, a force of nature that had been trapped too long and was now tasting freedom. Elias felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear coursing through him. He realized that the creature was far more powerful than he had imagined, that his curiosity and ingenuity had released something unstoppable. Yet he also sensed that the dragon had not come to harm him, at least not yet. A silent bond had formed in that instant, a fragile trust that could be broken by a single wrong move or a careless gesture. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced. The dragon's tail lashed and knocked over broken stone columns and debris scattering across the floor. It coiled its massive neck and roared again, then paused, tilting its head, studying Elias. The air shimmered with the energy of its power, every breath a reminder that this was no ordinary creature. It was the deadliest guardian the world had ever known. Yet here it was, awake, free and aware, and for the first time in centuries its eyes glimmered with something more than fury, curiosity, anticipation, and perhaps a trace of gratitude flickered in the depths of its gaze. Elias swallowed hard. He knew that nothing would ever be the same. He had stepped into a story far larger than himself, and now he had to decide whether he would run or stand and face the consequences of freeing a being whose power could reshape the world. Elias stood frozen as the dragon coiled its massive body around the shattered remains of the cage, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart pound in his chest. He could feel the vibrations of its growls in his bones, and yet he sensed that it was not merely anger, it was awareness, curiosity, and perhaps even a form of recognition that he could not fully comprehend. The air between them crackled with energy, each movement of the dragon sending sparks from the broken runes flickering across the chamber. Like fireflies in the dark, he took a cautious step forward, testing the fragile bond that seemed to be forming. The dragon tilted its head and watched him closely, its wings twitching as if deciding whether to strike or allow his presence to continue. The tension was unbearable. Every instinct screamed at him to run, yet a strange sense of trust urged him onward. He could almost feel the centuries of captivity weighing on the creature, as if it were gauging whether he was worthy of its attention, or whether he was just another human to fear. The dragon exhaled a cloud of hot air that swept across the chamber, sending dust swirling, and Elias could see its scales shimmer with iridescent light. The pattern seemed almost alive, moving and pulsing, with a rhythm that matched his own racing heartbeat. He held his breath, and slowly reached out a hand, the metal of the cage cold and jagged under his fingers. Still attached to the remnants, he whispered in a voice barely audible, hoping the dragon could understand in some way that he meant no harm. To his amazement, the dragon lowered its massive head closer to him, nostrils flaring and eyes narrowing as if examining the very essence of his being. Elias could feel the raw power emanating from it like a storm held just beyond control, and yet the creature did not strike. It simply lingered, testing boundaries and seeking understanding. He realized that it was as intelligent as it was dangerous, and that forming any kind of connection would require patience, courage, and respect. Hours seemed to pass as they studied each other, the dragon stretching and flexing its wings, occasionally letting out low growls that vibrated through the chamber, while Elias slowly moved closer, taking careful steps. The flickering light of the lantern casting shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling. He realized that he was learning to read its movements, to anticipate its reactions, and perhaps in some small way, it was learning about him, the dance between predator and companion, delicate and dangerous, yet strangely compelling. At one point, the dragon pressed a clawed foot gently against a fallen beam, and looked at him, waiting for a response. Elias nodded slowly and stepped aside. The trust between them grew incrementally, a fragile understanding forming across centuries of separation and fear. The chamber was filled with a tense silence, punctuated by the occasional rumble and the faint crackle of magical energy still lingering in the air. It was a dangerous connection, yet it was real, and in that moment he knew that he had become more than a mechanic. He had become a participant in something larger and infinitely more perilous than anything he had ever imagined. Though fear still gnawed at the edges of his courage, Elias could not deny the thrill of being seen by a creature so powerful and ancient, and he sensed that their bond would shape the challenges to come. The dragon had awakened, but so had their intertwined destinies, and neither could turn back now. Elias sat on the cold stone floor, his back pressed against the wall, and watched the dragon as it coiled and stretched, the faint glow of its scales casting flickering shadows across the ruined chamber. He could feel the energy radiating from it, a mixture of power and sorrow that made the air feel thick and alive for hours. He had observed its movements, its careful testing of boundaries, and the subtle intelligence in its gaze. But now he sensed something more, something ancient and weighty, pressing against the very fabric of the air. The dragon lowered its massive head toward Elias, and exhaled a puff of warm air that smelled faintly of smoke and metal. It stared at him with eyes that seemed to contain centuries of history, images and memories flashing through Elias's mind like fragments of a dream. The dragon's voice spoke not in words but in visions, powerful emotions and glimpses of the past flooding his senses. Images of kingdoms rising and falling, wars waged over power, and fear of its strength, rulers who had sought to control it and ultimately trap it, leaving it bound and forgotten for centuries in this very chamber. Elias felt the pain of centuries pressing against him, the betrayal and isolation, the endless years of captivity that had shaped the dragon into a force of fury and mistrust. He understood now why the runes glowed with such intensity, why the cage had been built so complex, and why no human had ever dared approach it. It had been imprisoned, not simply to contain its power but to erase it from the memory of the world, as though rulers feared a being whose strength and wisdom could challenge everything they had built. The visions shifted to show Elias fleeting moments of beauty, a dragon, soaring through open skies, free and untethered, its wings slicing through clouds and sunlight reflecting off scales, a reminder of what it had once been and what it could be again. The contrast between freedom and imprisonment hit him with overwhelming force. He could feel the weight of centuries of stolen liberty, and the anger that had been bottled up like a storm, waiting to break. As the visions faded, the dragon lifted its head slowly and met his gaze again. Elias could feel the silent question forming in the space between them, whether he would continue to treat it as a dangerous creature, or recognize it as an intelligent being wronged by history and capable of trust. He realized that the bond they had begun to form was not just fragile, but critical. The world outside had no idea of the danger and the magnitude of what had been hidden within these ruins for generations. Elias's mind raced as he absorbed the truth. He understood the responsibility he had taken on by freeing the dragon, that he was no longer merely a mechanic following a map, but a witness to history and a partner in a living force whose power could reshape everything he had known. The dragon's low rumble vibrated through the chamber, as if acknowledging his understanding, a silent agreement forming that their destinies were now intertwined, and that the next steps they took would define the fate of both human and guardian. The air seemed to hum with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. Elias knew there was no turning back. The secret had been revealed. The dragon had shared its burden, and in return, he had shared his courage, and now together they faced a world that had forgotten its most dangerous and magnificent guardian, waiting to see if humanity could rise to meet the challenge of its power. Elias barely had time to breathe as the dragon coiled and stretched its massive wings, preparing to move through the ruins. The ground shook under the sheer weight of its limbs, and the chamber seemed ready to collapse around them. Every instinct screamed at him to stay alert, and yet he could not look away from the creature that had become both his companion and his responsibility. The distant echoes of approaching footsteps and shouting voices reached their ears, human intruders drawn by the rumors of treasure and power, moving quickly through the forest and ruins without warning. The dragon lashed out with its tail, smashing a crumbling column to the ground, sending dust and debris swirling in every direction. Elias ducked instinctively, his heart hammering as the shockwave of the impact rattled the stone walls. The intruders shouted and cursed, but they were no match for the raw power and speed of the awakened guardian. It let out a low roar that shook the very stones and sent a flock of birds scattering into the gray sky beyond the broken windows. The dragon's eyes glimmered with intelligence and fury as it assessed the situation, waiting for Elias to act. Elias scrambled to gather his satchel and tools, his mind racing for a plan. He could feel the dragon's energy pulsing like a storm around him, and he realized that survival depended on moving together, trusting one another completely. The first steps were cautious, weaving through the shattered corridors and fallen beams, as the intruders closed in, their shouts echoing eerily. The dragon shifted and coiled with precision, crushing obstacles and clearing paths as Elias followed, scrambling over rubble and leaping across gaps. The ruins seemed to conspire against them, each step a test of courage and ingenuity. They emerged into the open forest. The intruders shouted orders and fired arrows that bounced harmlessly off the dragons. Scales Ilias's pulse quickened. The air was filled with tension and adrenaline. The dragon spread its wings, fully lifting its body gracefully over fallen trees and jagged rocks. Elias clung tightly to a ridge along its back, heart racing as they soared over the treetops, the wind whipping through his hair, and the roar of the dragon filling his ears. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The pursuit intensified as more soldiers emerged from the forest, their horses thundering along the dirt paths and their weapons glinting in the morning sun. The dragon ducked and twisted expertly, using the terrain to their advantage. Elias held on and shouted warnings as branches scraped his arms and leaves stung his face. The creature moved with a lethal grace, weaving through the forest like a shadow of death and freedom combined. Every heartbeat was a reminder that they were being hunted, yet unstoppable together. By the time they reached the edge of a wide river, Elias could see the exhaustion on both the human and dragon side. The intruders paused at the bank, unable to follow the dragon into deep waters with the current and rocks tumbling downstream. The pursuit faltered. The dragon set them down gently on a secluded bank, dripping with water and mud. It lowered its massive head to meet Ilias's eyes, and in that silent moment he knew they had survived together. But the danger was far from over. Their journey was only beginning, and the world beyond awaited. Elias and the dragon finally reached a hidden valley, nestled between jagged mountains and thick forests, a place untouched by humans for centuries. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine and earth. The sunlight filtered through mist and reflected off a crystal-clear river that wound like a silver ribbon through the valley. The dragon lowered its massive wings to the ground and shook itself, sending droplets of water and dust into the air. Elias watched in awe, feeling the raw power and majesty of the creature before him, and yet he also sensed a quiet calm settling over the valley, as if the land itself recognized the guardian that had returned to freedom. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching on the soft soil beneath him, and the dragon turned its head, tilting it slightly as if inviting him closer. The bond they had forged in the ruins now felt solid, unspoken trust, linking human and dragon in a way that transcended fear and understanding. Together, they had survived the dangers of the world, and now they stood at the threshold of something new, something neither of them could have imagined alone. Elias knelt beside the river and dipped his hand into the cold water. The dragon mirrored him, lowering its massive head and drinking beside him. The reflection of its scales shimmered in the surface of the water, a kaleidoscope of dark metal and molten light. The sight filled him with a mixture of humility and pride. He had freed a creature that had been bound for centuries, and in doing so had become a part of its story, a story that now included him as its guardian and companion. For hours they explored the valley, the dragon testing its wings and strength, Elias climbing rocks and tracing the edges of the cliffs. The sense of freedom was intoxicating each moment, a reminder of the dangers they had faced and the trust that had been built through shared survival. The valley seemed like a sanctuary, a place where the dragon could be itself, away from humans who feared its power, and humans like Elias who might not understand it fully. At dusk, Elias lit a small fire near a cluster of rocks, and the dragon curled beside it, its head resting on its massive forelimbs. The warmth of the flames reflected off its scales, casting moving shadows that danced across the valley floor. Elias felt a profound connection not just to the dragon but to the world around him. The hardships and fears of the past were still present, yet softened by the triumph of survival and the bond that had been forged in the heat of dangers. Night fell, the stars emerged one by one, brilliant points of light reflected in the river, and the dragon lifted its head to gaze at them, its eyes glowing faintly. Elias felt a surge of awe, knowing that this creature had seen worlds rise and fall, and now it was beginning a new chapter with him. By its side he realized that his life as a simple mechanic was over. He had become a guardian, a companion to something legendary and terrifying and magnificent. The valley was silent except for the gentle ripple of water and the soft rumble of the dragon's breath. Elias smiled, knowing that together they could face whatever came next, their destinies intertwined, and their bond unbreakable. The dragon had been freed, and in freeing it he had discovered courage and purpose. Beyond anything he had imagined, he had become part of a story that would be remembered for centuries, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive and ready for whatever the future held.